Hello. C.S. Lewis uses mountains in his stories quite differently than, say, his friend Tolkien. In Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's mountains are mostly fearsome obstacles that are to be overcome either by going over them, as the Fellowship of the Ring attempts to go over Caradhras and fail, or under them, as they go under Khazad-dûm to their great cost. His mountains are full of peril. The White Mountain of Gondor has more of a symbolic and sacred resonance, but we mustn't get sidetracked into that. Lewis has more or less two rather different uses of mountains in his stories. There's a view of the mountains in the far distance, which for Lewis is symbolic of a spiritual desire or longing. And there's the idea of going further up and further into the mountains, which is more of an emblem of heaven itself in the end. Let me explain. In his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, Lewis tells us about the Castlereagh Hills, which they called the Green Hills, that he saw every day from the windows of his childhood home in Belfast, which, though they were close enough, they seemed to him so unattainable. They taught me longing, Sehnsucht, he says, and that before the age of 6. And he used the German word for longing or yearning, you see. And that piercing longing was always a key element of the kind of joy that Surprised by Joy is all about. His brother Warnie, who was a year older than him, said it like this: "We would gaze out of our nursery window at the slanting rain and the grey skies, and there, beyond a mile or so of sodden meadow, we would see the dim high line of the Castlereagh Hills, our world's limit, a distant land, strange and unattainable." And that idea of a distant land, strange and unattainable, was a powerful force on Lewis's imagination. And he tells us in Surprised by Joy how in his teens he loved the view from a particular point on the Hollywood Hills above Belfast, where he could look out across the fields of County Down to the mountains of Mourne, blue and transparent in the furthest distance. And it's the distance which is key, he emphasises. Here, he says, was the way to the world's end, the land of longing, the breaking and blessing of hearts. Sometimes they're blue, he says, sometimes violet, but quite often they look transparent, as if huge sheets of gauze had been cut out into mountainous shapes and hung up there, so that you could see through them to the light of the invisible sea at their backs. Well, they were one of the channels through which the joy would come to him. Though he says if you went there, you wouldn't find the joy. It would be far off again, still distant. In his sermon, The Weight of Glory, he explains that the beauty comes through such things. They're images of what we really desire. They're not the thing itself. And you often find Lewis speaking of blue, transparent hills in the distance. They all perhaps have something of a memory of those mountains of Mourne about them. So, for instance, in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, when giant Rumblebuffin demolishes the gatehouse of the White Witch's house, a glorious view across the Narnian landscape was opened up, so that all the liberated creatures, no longer statues incarcerated in a dark, gloomy castle, could look out on sun-drenched grassland and forest and glittering streams, and beyond them, this sight so dear to Lewis, the blue hills. In The Horse and His Boy, the boy Shasta grew up pretty much as a slave in the land of Calaman and was deeply drawn to the north, where all he could see was a grassy slope sweeping up to a ridge where he was not allowed to go. And he came to the conclusion that there must be some delightful secret beyond the hill to the north, which his father refused to talk about and had no interest in. Far to the north, of course, was Narnia and the northern mountains which mark Narnia's borders. So after running away and negotiating the city of Tashbaan, Shasta eyes up the mountains beyond the desert where he's headed. One blue height is Mount Pyre, which is to be his guide crossing the desert. And he and his companions, they trek ever towards the blue peaks of the northern mountains, which mark that frontier of Narnia, their promised land beyond the desert. And it's on one of those mountains that Shasta encounters Aslan. A golden light, like the sun, shines upon Shasta from the lion beside him. No one ever saw anything more terrible or beautiful, it says. And after that, Shasta comes down from the mountains into the magic land of Narnia on the other side, and his life is never the same again. The mountain on Dragon Island in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader was the place of encounter with Aslan for Eustace too, of course. Eustace's diary entry for the 9th of September goes land in sight, a very high mountain a long way off to the southeast. And little does he know that this sighting of a far-off mountain will become the site of his regeneration. In a mountain valley, he becomes a dragon, mirroring the sheer nastiness of his dragonish heart. But there, on a mysterious mountain height, Aslan sets him free, and he's transformed. Once, when he was on holiday in Donegal, Lewis described a landscape touched with lovely gleams at times in which far-off mountains show 3 times their real height and with a radiance that suggests Bunyan's Delectable Mountains. In Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, the mountains that Christians saw were not heaven. Heaven was still far off, but they were on the way, a waymark, a foretaste of the heavenly place. In Till We Have Faces, Lewis's version of the myth of Cupid and Psyche, Psyche has always loved the mysterious God-trodden mountain, the grey mountain beyond the kingdom of gloam, and yearned to go there. She tries to explain to her sister Aurora. It was when I was happiest that I longed most. It was on happy days, when we were up there on the hills, the 3 of us, with the wind and the sunshine, where you couldn't see Gloam or the palace. Do you remember? The colour and the smell, and looking across at the grey mountain in the distance. And because it was so beautiful, it set me longing, always longing. Somewhere else there must be more of it. Everything seemed to be saying, Psyche, come. But I couldn't not yet come, and I didn't know where I was to come to. It almost hurt me. I felt like a bird in a cage when the other birds of its kind were flying home. And she says that the sweetest thing in all my life has been the longing to reach the mountain, to find the place where all the beauty came from. My country, the place where I ought to have been born. Do you think it all meant nothing, all the longing for home? For indeed it now feels not like going, but like going back. In that story, the mountain is both a symbol for the longing and then the setting for the thing itself. And this brings me to the other main meaning of the mountain in Lewis, the further up and further in meaning, further up and further into heaven. For Psyche, the grey mountain was the home of the god Cupid, and ultimately her home too. In Perilandra, on the planet Venus, the holy mountain, called the Hill of Life, is the place from which the Adam and Eve of that unfallen world in all their glory will judge and hearten their people. It's paradise. In The Great Divorce, which is Lewis's imaginative depiction of heaven, we're often aware of distant mountains. Very far away, I could see what might be either a great bank of cloud or a range of mountains. Sometimes I could make out in it steep forests, far withdrawing valleys, and even mountain cities perched on inaccessible summits. At other times it became indistinct. The height was so enormous that my waking sight could not have taken in such an object at all. Light brooded on the top of it. One of the bright spirits says, every one of us lives only to journey further and further into the mountains. The whole objective is to go on to the mountains. It will be joy going to the mountains, says another spirit. And another, look, the sun is coming over the mountains there. It will be up any moment now. The end of time as we know it is approaching, and as it does, the sunrise begins to peep above the mountain tops. At the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, the ship ploughs through the last sea towards the world's end, and the sun is shining very much brighter than usual, 3 times bigger, and only the sweet seawater at the easternmost edge of the world enables Caspian's company to bear it, until at last they can look right through the heart of the shining sun and beyond their world into Aslan's country. And along with a sweet fragrance and a momentary strain of heartbreakingly beautiful music, Lucy, Edmund and Eustace get a fleeting sight of that land. Now they could see something not only behind the wave, but behind the sun. They could not have seen even the sun if their eyes had not been strengthened by the water of the last sea. But now they could look at the rising sun and see it clearly and see things beyond it. What they saw, eastward beyond the sun, was a range of mountains. It was so high that either they never saw the top of it or they forgot it. None of them remembers seeing any sky in that direction. And the mountains must really have been outside the world, for any mountains, even 1/4 of a 20th of that height, ought to have had ice and snow on them. But these were warm and green and full of forests and waterfalls, however high you looked. And then in the last battle, they enter fully the real Narnia with its strong summer light and fragrant air and morning freshness, its vivid colours, its fruits that make the best of our fruits, like cough mixture in comparison. And the whole company race ahead to the mountains. Farther up and farther in, they cry. And the first 6 chronicles end with a foretaste of heaven one way or another, but this 7th ends in the full actuality. The farther up and farther in you go, the bigger everything gets, explains Mr. Tumnus to Lucy. There's always more. And then at last, there's the lion himself, because after all, the whole point about Aslan's country is that it's Aslan's. Heaven without Christ would not be heaven. The whole point is that he's there. And so he comes, wonder of wonders, leaping down the mountains like a cataract of power and beauty at the end of the last battle. And nothing's ever the same again, for as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion, but the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them, says Lewis. You know, it was the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader when Aslan told Edmund and Lucy that they wouldn't be coming back to the old Narnia, that Lucy sobbed, "It isn't Narnia, you know. It's you."